All right, so good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is William Roca. I am the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. Before we get started with this evening's presentation, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, the collected conceits, delusions, and hijinks of New Yorkers from 1974 to 1995, pardon my typo there, should not be 1955, 1995, with Stan Mack. If you're not familiar with Village Preservation, we were founded in 1980 and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've secured landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods, and we host over 75 free programs like this. So your support is incredibly important. To our members tuning in this evening, a very big thank you. Your support helps make this possible. For those of you who are not members, please consider becoming a member to Village Preservation and helping support our programming and our advocacy work. You can see that QR code on your screen there. Go ahead, scan it. Take a look at our website, the work that we do. We offer a lot of great resources on there, blogs, maps, and the list of our upcoming programs. So later this week, we have Remembering Bohemian New York, a toast to Pfaff Cellar. And this is the beer cellar that Walt Whitman attended in the 1850s. So it is part of our Pride programming here in June. And that's going to be on Thursday, June 27th at 6 p.m. It's an in-person program. We'll be having that at the Parish Hall of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. Now to introduce our guest this evening. Stan Mack pioneered a documentary style of cartooning with his legendary New York comic strip, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, which ran in the Village Voice. A giant collection of those strips, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, the collected conceits, delusions, and hijinks of New Yorkers from 1974 to 1995, was published this month and is available for order. His other long-running comic strips include Mule's Diner for National Lampoon, Stan Mack's Outtakes, Adweek, and Stan Mack's Real Mad, MediaPost.com. He's a graduate of Rhode Island School of Design and a former art director for the New York Herald Tribune's Book Week, the New York Times Book Review, and pardon me, and the New York, what does it say at the bottom? I can't read at the bottom. It's covered up by my Zoom controls here. The New York Times Sunday Magazine. There we go. Stan, a very big welcome to you. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, William. Glad to be here.
All right. So after all these years, what inspired you to put together this collection and publish it? Because it's a really incredible collection, a very specific time period in New York City's life, and I suspected in your life as well. So yeah, why did you feel now was the right time to put this together?
It's been a long time, you're right, since 1995 when we walked away from it. It was just time in a way. You look for projects of different sort to do over the years. I've been an illustrator, an art director, comic strip artist, but somehow it was time. Somehow it struck me that if I could pitch the idea of going back in time, listen, with all the problems that are going on today in this country, the idea of the 70s and 80s, which is there's been a kind of a nostalgia, I think, I've been picking up on social media very often, that looking back to a time which was so different, very simple, for all of the economic problems and the drama of the post-war years and then the 80s. And yet there's something special about that time. You see topics showing up all over the place, younger people who never could have lived through it. looking at it with some envy. I don't know, but anyway, enough that we thought we'd pitch it. And I'm grateful Fantagraphics did a hell of a job, and they put it together, went for it, and it is big. I've got one sitting next to me here. It's you got to do your exercises before you take it on. And I would say that once you get into the material itself, it might be a good idea to take it in small bits because your brain could frazzle after a while. There's just too much going on in there.
And because it's an awesome collection, over 300 pages in there. Does that cover all of the artwork you did through those years, or were there specific collections, were there specific strips that you wanted included in the book?
Both included and excluded. It was 20 years, almost exactly. And that makes just about 1,000 weekly comic strips. So I believe there's 275 in there. I haven't actually gone through it lately, but somewhere short of 300, I think, which makes it a lot less than half of the total, all of which are under my bed to the extent that they've survived. So what to choose and what not to choose, a lot had to do with who we're talking to, as with the people listening in tonight. I wanted to do a cross section as much as possible of the sort of places I went to that were especially New York, and also kind of fit in a sense, the demographic, the people who are out there. There are an awful lot I didn't put in there for a variety of reasons. One, they were just too strange. There are a couple of oddball ones in there because that was the era we were all living through. But there are some that are even more wacky than that. And I thought, well, maybe not. And then, interestingly, maybe there's some people, that was a very low demographic for kids being born in the late 60s and early 70s. While I have two sons that came along around that time, uh, generally it was not a kid world. So that a number of my strips had to do with my own kids and their friends, but that I thought was a little bit outside the reach of the eras I was covering. So while there are some in there, that was one category I didn't push. And then I did a lot of traveling in those years around the world, really. And there are a number of strips that had to do with where we were traveling, whether it was the Middle East or Asia or Central America. So I thought that wasn't really primary to what this book was supposed to be about.
And for the ones that you ended up including, obviously the focus is New York and us kooky New Yorkers who inhabit this city and stay in this city and make it the great city that it is. But was there any other kind of like a thematic approach that you took, or some other thread that kind of ties all of these comics together that made you want to have them in the book?
It was partly just chronology. We did try to break it down a few different ways: sex, home, adventure, and flying around. But finally, because it was my life too, from 74 until 95, 20, we all changed over the course of 20 years. And I'm from far away. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island, about as far away as you could get from New York City in a way. So it was all new to me when I hit town, and I changed and grew personally over the course of those 20 years. Plus, the city changed so dramatically uh, during those same years. I thought the best way to approach it would be to literally break it down into 11 chapters. I wrote an intro to each chapter in which I introduce what was going on in that chapter, and then finally the evolution, the changes that took place. I try to document as well in the intro. So the theme is simply New York in the 70s and 80s, basically.
And being from originally out of New York, do you feel like that gave you kind of a unique eye on the city because it's seeing things in a way for the first time and giving it a fresh perspective. Do you think that that helped make your comics as successful as they were?
I think so. I'm a little bit older than the boomers. So in a way, it was a little bit like I dropped down from Mars. Everything was new, and the people were new. So it gave me a perspective. I think some of it was just who I am, and others were the era we were living through. I went from place to place, always as a bit of an outsider. I wasn't a reporter, and I tried to be the same as the people I was covering, but basically, I was uh, a bit outside the world and try, at least to begin with. As I got a little bit more sophisticated, the story approaches changed as well. But to begin with, as you suggest, I was an outsider. Uh, I was able to make fun of everybody in the early days before my empathy kicked in. It didn't matter which part of the spectrum you were on. I was there to listen, pay attention, not formulate ideas in advance, but find out what was going on there, writing like mad in my little pads, unobtrusively as possible, also sketching people who were speaking those words. It really was important to me that the people in my sketches dressed and looked like the ones who were speaking those words. There's no generic characters in this book. They're all as close as possible as I could do it to the people who were actually speaking. And I've had notes, calls over the years saying, "Hey, you know that one you did that week in the third panel, there was a guy with a beard. That was me. Well, that was my brother. Could you sign my clip, which is ratty and on the refrigerator door?"
And and your style, it's a very particular style, but were there other comic artists that were an influence on you? And did your style in any way you feel change as your observations and the way you thought of things that you were observing changed?
I Crookshank. We studied art, the history of art, at the Rhode Island School of Design. So I was very aware of the satirists of 150 years ago. But coming closer to that, Willard Mullen in his war years, I'm sorry, Bill Malden in his war years, Willard Mullen in his sports drawings, both these guys captured life in their own way that I totally admired their style. For one thing, Malden is in the mud with the guys he was covering. I mean, that really was real life funnies. And there was the officer class was up above him someplace. And Willard Mullen was brilliant at going to the games and coming back with a drawing style that was both quick and full of character. And while it was all sports, it was breaking news all the time. That's what he did. So those two guys, while influencing me a lot, when you talk about what style I had, I was a scratcher with pen and ink. All my lines look like that. But the thing that drove this thing was the deadline, the deadly deadline. Once I agreed to take this project on, I would go someplace different every week, but it had to be delivered that Monday night, the latest, and I was never early. So having to create this thing over the course of a day, having gathered it for a few days in advance, putting it down on paper, scratching away with my left hand, which continually was smudging the ink, and getting there in time, that creates your head and creates the drawing style all by itself.
Well, you have a whole bunch of sites. Do you want to go ahead and put up your show so folks can see some of your comics?
Sure, I'll hit
And
this.
everyone, as Stan is pulling up his slideshow, if you have questions now or through the program, please don't hesitate. Pop them into the Q&A feature, the chat.
I started with this one just because it's fun. It has me in it. I drew myself as a little character with a mustache and a square nose. It was very handy to have a character through which the reader could enter the story. And this was such a kooky, overheard line. that I thought, let's start with that one.
Well, I think what we've all been there living in apartment buildings, riding the subway, have heard some oddball scenarios.
The street meant hallways and old brownstones. It meant oh, Central Park. It meant all over town, down to the waterfront. Uh, I I particularly chose this one because it's part of a full strip. Most of these I zeroed in on a panel or three, because it was a little hard to see, I thought, the whole strip. So this is a portion of a story. Some people will remember Trudy Hellers. It was a hot night spot in the village back in the day. This might have been 77. And the high-heeled women with whom I became friendly and hung out with a lot. A sexy comic troupe. They were quite wonderful, funny, great dancers. And here they are appearing one Sunday night at Trudy Hellers, trying to drum up business outside. And of course, it was a Sunday night. It was a tough task for them. But some people here may remember that the high-heeled women cabaret act as well. So I'll plug along here. Uh, when I started Real Life Funnies, I pitched the idea. I had been an art director at the New York Herald Tribune, the so-called home of the new journalism. I was swept up with both journalism and the columnists like Jimmy Breslin. I had to read everyone they did in order to illustrate them as the art director. I mean, purchase illustration. I also was an illustrator, commercial illustrator, doing work with drawing that looked a lot like this. So I went back to freelance illustrating from my job at the Times because I just wanted to get free of corporate America. Even New York Times is a corporation. And in doing, went looking for assignments. Now, usually an illustrator waits for the phone to ring or pitches portfolios to our art directors in magazines and advertising. I wanted to figure out a way to initiate my own stories. And while I wasn't a natural writer, I knew I could, it had been shown to me through a couple of assignments I gave myself that I could go out and sketch people. And I was picking up interesting lines. I had a gauge in my head that said, that line is worth writing down, and ignore the other lines. I went out with a dear friend, Georgia DeLay, who was a reporter at the Times a couple of times, to illustrate her pieces. But when we got back to the Times, she said, you've got some pretty, you wrote down some pretty good lines here. That's my job. What are you doing? Anyway, so I knew I had a little feel for it. So I went to Milton Glaser, the great Milton Glaser, who was then with Clay Felker redoing the Village Voice. They were not downtown people. They were from New York Magazine. Clay Felker was pure Upper East Side. But I said to Milton, what do you think about the idea if I do a piece where I wander around town and listen to people and sketch what they look like? And he said, great. But comic strips are circulation builders. Why don't you do it every week? We'd love to see that. I thought, really? One guy is going to go out into New York City and wander around every single week? But I said, okay, I'll try it. And Felker said, why don't you go to Bloomingdale's, Mr. Upper East Side? So I went to Bloomingdale's. This is one panel for the strip I did and delivered that week. And it's just classic Bloomingdale's in my mind. So I got there and I said to the real voice editors, I mean, Glaser and Felker were really not the people who were turning out the voice every week. I said to them, okay, here it is. And they said, what is this? And I said, well, I went to Bloomingdale's and I wrote down what people said and I just sketched what they look like. And here it is. And they said, what are you talking about? That's a comic strip. How do we know these are real? We can't fact check this thing. What are we going to even call it? And I said, well, I don't know. Call it what you want. So they said, well, if we have to run it, we'll call it Real Life Funnies. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, Pfeiffer could be Real Life Funnies, and even though he doesn't do what I do. he was creating out of his head New York City. Well, all right, so we'll call it, we guarantee it verbatim. I didn't even know what verbatim meant. I had to look it up. And somebody else said, well, we can't guarantee it verbatim because we're not there. We'll have Stan Mack guarantee it. So we'll put his name big at the front. And that's how the title, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, came to be. But I realized that Bloomingdale's was boring and too easy. If I was going to do this every single week, I had to take more risks. I had to get out of my comfort zone. I had to go places I didn't belong. The only time I really went back to Bloomingdale's was when Darth Vader made an appearance there, signing lightsabers or something. And I just did. What was really funny about this one, Darth took a lunch break from signing, and he goes back up the escalator, and they said, Darth, what would you like for lunch? And he said, get me a tuna on white and a tab. This is Darth Vader. So anyway, I moved on from there, and this was New York in the 70s. Everybody was looking for, and the war was over, Nixon was gone, Vietnam was almost gone. People were turning inward, you might say, looking for a new kind of spirituality or a new kind of remaking of themselves. What Tom Wolfe called the me generation. It was all about themselves. And as part of that, as you can say, it was classic. And some people out there may remember those days. So I would start to go places because you can't just walk around the streets and overhear things. And it being the 70s, people were offering rapping being a way to reveal something of themselves and perhaps new people. This took place at the Unitarian Church. This is also one panel out of a big strip. The Unitarian Church on the Upper West Side. And I was going to go there and listen in on people and do a strip on that. I was telling a friend of mine, an illustrator, what I was going to do. And he said, do you mind if I come along? And I said, sure. So we met outside that evening where the singles again were going to meet and talk about themselves and perhaps meet an interesting new person. So we're standing at the door and he says, okay, so what happens? And I said, well, we go in there and sit down, pretend to be a single again, make up a little story, kind of boring, but one that will keep the circle moving, and you'll become a part of it. And I will try as much as I could to write down what people are saying as surreptitiously as possible on a napkin or a little pad I stuck in my pocket. At the same time, sketch what they might look like. And he said, you're telling me you're going to go in there and lie? And I said, well, yeah, that's true. I think of it as method acting more than lying. He said, I can't do that. And he left. Anyway, I put this up to show you that that's how I was beginning to go beyond simply overhearing and getting involved in people's lives. Not to say overhearing wasn't essential to those early years. This is a collection I did up at the Sheep Meadow in Central Park, where I had a great time sketching the bodies. I love life drawing, always have, and overhearing what people were saying. Now, granted, I wasn't in one place. I was wandering around, and maybe it was 2 or 3 visits to Central Park that produced all of these comments. But, for a guy to say, and I say bullshit, people go into art because it's an accepted way to fail. I mean, that was in my wheelhouse, really. Or Jewish chimney sweeps. Not to say that it wasn't sometimes more adventurous than I might have anticipated. There were still protests in the 70s, more about Wall Street and nuclear reactors and money. That's me being booted out of the way by a cop on a police horse for trying to nose in too close to what was going on. But this was classic. Don't be a whore for money. Take the day off. Somebody has to pay for your welfare. It's classic 70s stuff. I hope people are uh, reading these things. They're kind of fun. This another was a strip in which I went to a gathering of people who were believers of UFOs. And I said, fine, if I'm good with that. So I hung out with them and did a comic strip on that. But I mean, you think about it, this guy saying if you were a baby in a womb and somebody inserted something in there, you'd say, oh, there's a UFO. Well, you can't argue with that. That's accurate. The thing that I discovered was that rather than just running a whole bunch of individual overheard comments, I wanted to introduce the topic in the first panel to tell the reader where they were that week. So I was working on having what I call the lead. Where are you folks? And here's where we are together. And at the end, have a panel that said, okay, we just had this little adventure together. And now we're going to leave together and leave the people contented enough and not full of questions about where they just were, because next week I was going to take them someplace entirely different for 20 years. This is an example of how much fun I could have. I remember gorillograms. You probably don't, but in the 70s, balloonograms, gorillograms.
I've seen them in movies.
A lot of this stuff will have shown up uh, in movies in later years as well. Anyway, so this was a woman going down to promote her own gorillogram business, but by dressing up as an ape and going down to Wall Street. And nothing was more fun than listening to people. Excuse me, which way is Thomas Street? I'm a gorilla. What do I know? Whatever you're on, I want some too. There was a certain amount of pot going on in those days. There were kinds of events that were not natural for me because my hearing was key. And when you go to a rock concert, these are the plasmatics. Some people may remember them at CBGB's, the great downtown rock and punk venue. So that was what they looked like. I sketched them on stage. I spent some time with them backstage, but then some of the talk was about where you buy supersize women's hose, because that was a big problem if they were going to be dressing up as in drag. But that's all I can do as far as capturing the actual music. And in time, I became more experienced at what I was doing. I even had a press pass after a while. So I would assign myself to go to classic downtown places. This was the 6th precinct, I think, which is where I lived at one time, over on Greenwich Street. And because I was from The Voice, and they thought I was a real reporter, I was able to go out on their adventures, which there was a crime involved, but you'd have to go and get the book to read the actual crime. There was crime all over the place in those days, so it was not hard to find, including muggings. I myself was mugged on 42nd Street at one point. People would often say to me when it appeared in The Voice, that didn't really happen, did it? Well, here's a case where I simply got on a bus and I could hear two people, what I thought were two people, talking from the back of the bus. And since I'm a comic strip artist, I simply worked my way back to where the voices were coming from, listening to them and writing down what they're saying. And I did different type faces because they sounded so different. But in fact, there was one woman playing both voices. And as I would say to people, you just can't make some of that stuff up. That's what she looked like. And you can't leave sex out of a history of the 70s and even 80s in a very different way in New York City, in The Voice. The Pink Pussycat was a store on Christopher Street that sold sex toys. So I went in there and hung out with them for a while, and these were the days when, in a sense, sex was coming out from the corners and the basement, and it was becoming a legitimate business at the time of the times. And that's what this was. The Pink Pussycat was a well-lit glass cases so you could see things, and people behind the counters, who were being helpful. I even went behind the counter at one point. I was demonstrating. They had a dildo with a crank in the back to make in one of those glass cases. But anyway, the woman on the right in this strip, very sexy babe as far as I could tell, very nice, and I drew her the way I thought she was. Years later, I would get mail. I still get mail. I got mail from a old bloke. He described himself as an old bloke in a tweed cap from London. And he said it was your strip that helped convince me that years later I could transition. That woman, whom I drew as a woman, is now a solid senior citizen, a guy running a successful PR company in London. The stories were everywhere. Speaking of sex, people probably know or have heard about Plato's Retreat. It was a sex joint in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel in the Upper West Side in the 70s, where people would go and have public sex. That's what it was. And I went, better dressed than most, who were basically naked, looking for a story. But sex on its own terms, that wasn't really what I did. But they had a legal bathing pool there, and because it was legal, they needed a licensed lifeguard. So he was there down at the back. That's me next to him in a towel. I actually had more clothes on than that. He was down at the deep end where, of course, any trouble that was going to develop would happen, but all of the action was taking place in the shallow end. There was no work, no actual work for him. But anyway, my story was an interview with the lifeguard at Plato's Retreat. I put this in because we talk about the downtown world. I don't know if people will remember the name Donna Henning. She was a spiritual woman. She had seminars and various things like that had to do with spirituality. And so this is at the World Trade Center, the real World Trade Center, in the plaza out front. Some people remember that globe in the middle. And she was having a spring equinox fertility rite there. Supposedly, in that moment when the sun was directly overhead, you could stand an egg on its end. Now, I think I've since found out that that's not accurate. If you're good enough, you can stand an egg on its end almost any time. But that was her event, and it was absolutely charming. People came. She did her thing. I interviewed a lot of people who were attempting to stand the egg on its end. One woman was so excited when she did it that she couldn't help but hug her boyfriend and be congratulated by him. One guy got away with it because he smashed the bottom and stood it up, and that was no problem at all. And so on. One pregnant woman said, well, I don't have to do it. My egg is already standing, and she has a big baby bump. At the end of the event, they asked this guy who was cleaning up, did you stand one up? And he said, no, lady, I picked them up after they were broken. but that was the World Trade Center. And it being the voice and downtown New York, there were characters around. I said at the beginning that I didn't always show some of the more extreme um, strips I did back then, but one of the people I did, uh, I think 3 different stories on, was the Rug Man. I called him the Rug Man. He became quite popular in time. This was a guy who had some problems, emotional problems maybe. He would wrap himself in a rug remnant and lie in a public space like a cement, any pavement, to be stepped on by people if they didn't know he was there. That was key to the excitement for him. And he would lie there quietly, hoping that somebody would, assuming it was just a rug remnant, step on him, at which point he somehow psychologically got off on that. That was the Rug Man. He became well known enough so that in time, people were hiring him to, let's say, lie at the entrance to a club so that people coming into the club would step on him. And he made a few bucks that way. But that's not what he was about. He was about being stepped on. I once went to a club in which he was behind the bar so that the bartenders running back and forth serving drinks were always stepping on him. He had an idea. I don't know whether he ever did whether he followed through, but you remember Jane Fonda exercise tapes from those days. He came up with the idea for a step tape, and he would be the step. I don't know whether he ever followed through with it, but that was he was classic downtown New York. And I have a confession. Every once in a while, somebody would tell me a story. This was a friend of mine, Ron Hauge, a very well-known cartoonist and writer. He was on The Simpsons. And before that, he was a poor, struggling cartoonist in New York City. So he's fine. But he told me this story back in the day. He lived on 13th Street and Avenue B in a rundown little crappy apartment because he didn't have any money at that point. And he was mugged. This is one half of the entire comic strip I did about this mugging. And I said, Ron, if you would let me just answer every question I can think of, grill you to get every detail right about the dialogue, I would tell the story even though I wasn't there. And from time to time, I did that. Actually, the Rug Man, I first heard about through a woman who experienced him on her way to a movie theater. So this was Ron's mugging on Avenue B and 13th Street. And him having sympathy for the mugger because he didn't have anything. They ended up sharing one of Ron's cigarettes. Ron has said, because he became a well-known artist, writer on The Simpsons, and before that on Seinfeld, he had been caricatured a few times by other cartoonists. And he said, nobody touched me with a caricature like you did in this comic strip. So I was proud of that. Things changed in the 80s. Everything changed. The younger brothers and sisters of the boomer generation were not like their older brothers and sisters. This was not Woodstock. They were coming to New York with MBAs. Money was very important to that crowd. The word yuppie was coined around 81, 82, somewhere. So I did I'm going to switch, so you'll see this in a second, right side up. I did a male yuppie and a female yuppie and went down and found out what defined their lives. This is a portion of the male yuppie. The female was very similar. Give you an idea. And everything mattered to them because clothing and presentation mattered because it was the way to money. And very different from the flower child approach or the bell-bottom approach of the earlier years. Is anybody asking any questions, by the way? I'm happy to uh, jump in with anything if they are.
Yeah, no, there's some question. I mean, if you want to keep going for a few more minutes and then we can
Okay.
go through
Okay.
to the
Uh,
questions. I think everyone's kind of just loving hearing your stories.
I will tell you, there is no way for me to capture what's in this book in a few slides because I took you somewhere else that I didn't belong every single week for 20 years. You can't, I can't capture that expanse. You'll have to find the book. But I do advise, not only is the book heavy, but when you sit down to read it, do it in small bites because it could fry your brain if you took on too many of these things at one time. Anyway, this was also, there's my character. Sometimes I used him to bring, as I think I said before, into the story. But here was a classic woman with an MBA coming to New York, and also classically in her talking about the first panel, the first word balloon was the way I set the tone. Feminists make me sick. Women's lib is a crock. A crock. How would Gloria Steinem handle that one? I got a C in feminism from my lesbian teacher in college. No use for that. Pick up a goddamn Wall Street Journal was her philosophy of life. I love money. And then she ended with, and I'm leaving here having been hit over the head a few times by her words. Creative people are weak, self-indulgent, lazy, hedonistic, airheads. I mean, an MBA is essential to life. I promise you, I didn't make up a word in this comic strip. I also didn't form an opinion when I was with her that would have undercut what she was saying. I wanted to be with her the whole time because that was the point. This is all about irony. Irony is a form of humor that some people get and some people don't get. Another example of women who really, all of the female athletes of today kind of owe their classroom, their sports classes in college, owe them to these women who were the first ones, I think, who started to go to the gym. I mean, the idea of biceps are the new breasts, pretty direct idea. This is uh, uh, sometimes I went out of town with the comic strip. You remember music videos. This was a Lionel Richie video done by a guy I knew, a terrific director, Bob Giraldi, who did a lot of advertising commercials and then went on to do Hollywood. But anyway, this is a music video with Lionel Richie in which I became the punchline. This is only one panel. It's pretty wild. They were short one, Bob Giraldi was short one Latin dancer. And he said, Stan, would you do it? I said, yeah. He said, we'll dress you up and you can be part of the background dancers. But finally, he looked at the take and went, Stan, you're a bit of a bozo. And he turned to the son of the guy who was playing the priest in the music video to take over for me. So that was me, my own punchline. I was my own punchline. But I was told it's a pretty good caricature of Lionel Richie. The 80s was nothing if not crack and cocaine. On the upper end, it was cocaine. And this guy, again, part of a larger strip, which was simply him. You don't see him until this last panel. It was simply him doing a line of coke and talking about it in a very positive way. It's almost like he's the way you would talk about a good wine. Exactly the same thing, really. a teensy bit uppity, slight sting in the nose, but good. It's the champagne of drugs, always a welcome gift at a party, at least the kind of parties he went to. I spent a lot of time in the late 80s in the squatter world of the East Village. I was fascinated by the whole idea of squatting and went over to find out more about it. There was a lot of ferment, a lot of protests going on there among social activists, young anarchists, communists, social welfare people, plain old lefties who wanted to do, who felt they wanted to take a stand about the homeless problem that was everywhere in those days, as it is even today. But in those days in the East Village, landlords were walking away from buildings, they couldn't keep them up, didn't care about them, left them to the city, which had no use for them either, although they were waiting for the real estate moguls to descend. Meantime, they were warehousing these old buildings, and people needing places to live and seeing this and being kind of outside society a bit were moving into the squats. And I wanted to find out what that was all about. So a number of the strips, not all of them are in this book, but a number of them are because it was such a powerful world. And for me, I had a beat, really. Before that, it was all of New York, but now I could go over to these villages, not every week or every day, but often enough so that I was recognizable. People, as usual, liked being in the strip. I got into some trouble from time to time, but not especially over there. Anyway, two of the squatters I met over there were not like the usual run of them, who were younger, sometimes even young Europeans. It was interesting. But Rex and Rosemary were clearly of a different type entirely. They were Westerners, Southerners, Westerners. They grew up and raised their kids. They told me about that in the West. They were really they were ranch backgrounds, very different from the New York world that they now were in, which they chose to be in. I spent a lot of time hanging out with Rex because he was such a colorful, gruff, and yet courtly in a way character himself, probably an alcoholic. So this was one time, and there were a lot of drug dealers in that world back then, looking for ways to set up supermarkets of drugs that was hidden. They were trying to take over this particular squad, and Rex was standing up to him, this tough old guy, as you can see here. And these guys were threatening with guns, and I saw some of it. But he said, "No way, you come back here, you're going to have to deal with me." And so we would hang out, and he would tell me that some of his life, background of his life, and Rosemary was a painter too, and they were basically eating out of garbage cans, but comfortable with the idea. That's what made them so different. Anyway, he said in passing, "By the way, I have a daughter who was the gossip columnist at New York Magazine." And I said, "Yeah, right, Rex." He said, "My name, my name is Walls. Jeannette Walls is my daughter." And being a good reporter, which I really was, when it came to this sort of thing, I fact checked. I called up New York Magazine and asked for Jeannette Walls because I had a bit of a name. They put me through to her. She thought I was looking for self-promotion, she said later on. I said, "I'm talking to this guy, Rex Walls, in the squat in East Village, and he claims to be your father." And there was this, I'll call it stunned silence at the other end. It turned out to be absolutely true. She was hiding it up to that point because the world she was living in was high fashion, high style anyway, trendy New York City. And that's what she was covering. She knew they were there and they would occasionally even meet, but up to that point, she was in the closet, you might say. But she said that comic strip. Oh, she did say one thing to me. "Look, I'm still hiding it. Would you mind? I can't tell you to do it, but if you wouldn't mind changing who I am for now. I think she graduated from Barnard or one of the elite women's colleges. And she said, "Would you mind changing those facts?" And I did. I said, "I don't run a gossip column. I can do that. The story is this character." And she was very grateful about. She's written the afterword for this book, and if you read it, it's absolutely wonderful. She loved that I did that, and she said, "You really captured my father in that one comic strip." She went on to write The Glass Castle. People may know that book was a huge bestseller based on her growing up years with these two characters. It was a tough, tough. It's a world. It's amazing that she and her, I think, two sisters and a brother survived it because they were insane in many ways. But that's the story of her. When I got in touch with her years later about this book, she said, "I'd love to write about it." They made a movie out of um, her life, based on the Glass Castle. There were a lot of stories. If we have time, I can tell you a quick one more. That is the. Do we have time for this?
Yes, please, please go right ahead.
One of the squatters not a squatter, but a activist I became friendly with, Bobby Fuller. He ran the Hobo Theater Company out of one of the squats, and all the actors were homeless people. It was just a wonderful thing that he was doing. And I did a few stories around him and the actors. They were doing Gorky's Lower Depth at that time. I think they ended up being on BAI. Anyway, I'm walking with Bobby one day. The cops are across the street. This is on 10th Street. The cops were across the street rousting the homeless. They were always clearing out the park. The park had been taken over by the homeless. And a group of activists came running by us, and Bobby said, we all knew each other. And he said, "Where are you going?" They said, "Well, there's this abandoned building right here on 10th Street. We're going to take it over, go upstairs and hang banners out the front attacking the police, criticizing the mayor." And Bobby said, "Can we come along?" And they said, "Yeah, sure, come on." So we all ran up into this building, up to the second or third floor. They barricaded us in, the guys who were doing this. The cops spot this, the banners, and come charging over to go up the stairs. They're going to batter down the I have it one slide of the batter down the door and arrest everybody. By the way, I don't show in this comic strip, but I was right next to him the whole time. Bobby has this kind of sling around his chest. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it's kind of a bulky sling. And they say, "We're going to arrest you guys." And he says to me, "I can't be arrested. I got to get out of here." And I said, "Well, it's not going to do my story any good either to be arrested." So we jumped out that back window, clambered down, and ended up jumping off a garage roof on Avenue B around the corner from 10th Street, where the abandoned building was. So I pull out my pad like I'm covering the event, and Bobby runs to the nearest phone booth. And he calls his wife, and he says, "Mary Beth, we're both fine." It turns out he got a 2-month-old baby in that sling, whom I named Emma in the comic strip, but her real name was Chea, after Che Guevara. I'll give you an idea of the politics of Bobby and Mary Beth. And he says, "This is very exciting. Emma has occupied her first building, but I had to get out of there. I couldn't get arrested because I didn't have enough formula if we were going to be in jail." Whew, great story. Anyway, that's not even the punchline, the end of the story. Bobby Fuller died very young of bone cancer. Very sad. And I lost track of Mary Beth and Chea, little baby Chea. I covered her a little bit. I knew her a little bit longer, but not much. And they were gone. Didn't know where. 30 years minus 2 months later, during COVID. I get a call from a tattoo artist in Austin, Texas, who says, I'm having a surprise birthday party for my wife, Chea, now the parents of two little kids. And we want you to be on it on Zoom, which I was. It was just amazing, emotional, because it was a surprise. I was there, a couple other people from Bobby's world back in the day. And she said to me afterwards, I didn't know my father. He died before I was really aware of it. But my mother saved your comic strips about him, and they were my family album. Anyway, that really got to me. And now I'm in touch with Jay all the time. I threw this in because I couldn't resist. Shades of Harvey Weinstein. Again, I know this woman extremely well, good friend. She told me this story. But it has happened exactly like this. Her friend was over. She went into the kitchen to get a couple of glasses of wine, came back, and there he is. I mean, he was important. She had an organization, nonprofit. So she was always looking for funding. Anyway, I don't want to belabor this thing, but I just thought that moment was too good not to do a comic strip about. Piero Helixer. I did a number of strips of homeless people. They were there. They were fascinating. Many homeless people, some were drugged out. Others had life stories. And if you would just sit with them for a while, they were willing to tell them. This guy was on some people, you'll recognize this, at 6th Avenue, West 4th Street entrance on the east side of the entrance on the east side of West 4th Street. And that time it was a bank. I mean, look at those numbers. You can get a mortgage loan for 10%. And I drew this scene as careful as I could. This was a guy, his name was Piero. That's what he told me. And everything he owned was right there. And he was very much into books. Later on, the punchline, in a sense, of this strip is that the cops in a garbage truck showed up and tossed everything that you're looking at here, got rid of it, and said, get out of here, Piero. You can't live here anymore. We told you this before. Anyway, in the meantime, he's telling me he's running for president. He had a pretty good, I won't go into the details, but a pretty good set of things he wanted to accomplish. But some of the stuff he was telling me about rang true. It was a little bit like with the squatter people, Rex. He's telling me some stuff like he went to Harvard. He would have been he dropped out, but he would have been the class of 58, which apparently is very famous Harvard class. And he talked about knowing Greek and Latin, that he's a poet, he's a 8mm filmmaker. It all turned out to be true. Piero Helixer was all of those things. He was an important part of the Andy Warhol crowd. He was an innovative filmmaker. He was an accomplished poet, gave talks, but he also had a mental problem. And there were years when he lived on the street. He lived in Amsterdam, and he lived in Paris. He was a child actor, really true, in Italy originally. Holocaust, people somehow caught up in the Holocaust back in the day. I'm now friends with both his sister, who's a terrific kids book author, writer, and his daughter, much younger daughter, who now has a film out called The Invisible Father that really is worth taking a look at. Drugs.
So sorry to interrupt, Sten. If we can make this honestly, I would like to sit here all night and just listen to every one of your stories. This is amazing.
This is a guy who has died of AIDS who was going undercover for a bunch of reporters to get the goods on a doctor was selling phony medicine to AIDS sufferers. Uh, this guy is now a stand-up comic. He's half Jewish, half black, sent to a private school where, in my mind, everybody was named Brookings Chandler. His name is Sarge. You can find him online. I tried to concentrate on the immigrant world of the late 80s and early 90s. That it was very important in those days. Uh, there's a whole comic strip to this. All right, occasionally turn my pad to face the voice. This actually happened. I was standing there one moment, and I overheard this line: "Is blow among two copy editors? Is blowjob hyphenated?" That was all I had to hear. I don't know if we have time to look at the whole strip, but Sonia Robbins, the woman with the pith helmet, came in and settled the argument. She was the one who often read me on Monday nights. I think we can end with this one. This was a group of punk rockers called Iron Prostate, and there's a strip in in the book, I'm sorry, which describes how the name Iron Prostate came about. You really should see because not comfortable to the guy it happened to, but definitely for us. I went with them, the Iron Prostate punk band, to the suburbs when someplace in Westchester to meet what they thought were a bunch of younger guys who would be very impressed by genuine punk rockers when the opposite turned out to be true. These guys who looked scarier than the than the punkers, and yet were more caught up with health benefits and real careers where they were going to get rid of their tattoos eventually because that wasn't going to get them a job on Wall Street. Very discouraging to all of us to discover that time was moving on, and the strip too had to move with them. So how about if we kind of end with that?
I mean, first I have to say, I mean, I'm already looking at the comics here. People want a part two, and I'm in agreement because these stories are just incredible. And actually, just a quick question. Some of the things that you've talked about this evening are some of those stories, those anecdotes in the book.
Some of for example, the one about there are a few, some I didn't get to, but the one about the trans guy and the one about Shea, I have in my intros, I brought in quoting some of them after the fact because I went to talk to them after when we were putting the book together. So there's that kind of thing going on as well.
Oh, amazing. I mean, some of those stories, I'm a crier, so I have to stop myself because
I won't
they're
tell you.
so, I mean, really amazing. But I want to get to some of the questions folks have asked. Right, and I just have to say, people are writing beautiful comments, thanking you for these strips, and they shape their view of New York and their sense of humor of when they were living in the city in the 70s and
I can
80s.
respond to that. Pete Hamill once said to me, "You know your audience. That's very good. You're not spreading your web too net too wide." And I said, "No, that's because my audience and the people in the strip are the same people. So these people are who are commenting. I wouldn't be surprised if they know somebody. If they weren't in it themselves, they know somebody. If they, even if they're a little bit younger, who was in some of those strips, because 20 years of people, there are a lot of folks in there."
Yeah. So I have one question here. Lisa says she loves your work, including your graphic memoir, Janet and Me. Could you discuss the process of creating that memoir and how it compares to the other forms that you've worked in?
Uh, Janet was critically important in the early 80s when I had an 18-year relationship with her. Critically important because she was such a character herself. And she knew such wonderful characters that I just think she was crucially important. Anyway, she got breast cancer in the 90s, which we fought together. I was doing a comic strip for the suburban sections of the New York Times and did one at the very end of 99, just before she died. And this was the New York Times, Sunday Magazine, Suburban Crowd were not ready for that comic strip. So there was an outpouring of anger in letters to the that those couple of weeks. And I did it in comic strip format. It ended up I ended up including it in a book I wrote called Janet and Me, in which all the skills I'd learned over these years I brought to doing a very serious memoir about how a male caregiver for a very colorful character could tell their story. It's not done in panel form because I thought at that time, which was kind of early, it was still early 2000s. There weren't graphic novels everywhere at that point. So I did a kind of a traditional narrative, but with a ton of my drawings throughout. And that's what that's about. It's called Jan and Me, and you can get it. It's got some terrific blurbs as well and good reviews.
Someone asking here if you knew their mentor, Cosmos, and I hope I say the surname correctly, Sarkiapone? Cosmos Sarkiapone, if you knew this person.
I I should be better at this. My memory was never very good. That's why I had to write everything down. That name sounds awfully familiar, but that's as far as I can carry it. I'd need more details to know for sure. Mentor what? That's the other question. An artist, a writer, a filmmaker?
So then we have another question. Some of your work reminds me of cinematic storyboards. And were there any filmmakers or documentarians that were important to you?
No, partly because the documentary, the flowering of the documentary world, I think came along after I started this. I wasn't as oriented to nonfiction filmmaking as I have become over the years. It's a brilliant work now being done. But they are right that these are the storyboards that you would have to go through some version of in putting together your notes, your films. I mean, my sketches are a lot like the scraps of film that probably people had to do on their way to doing a finished documentary. I had a lot of flexibility that they didn't have because I didn't need their equipment. I just needed a little tiny pad. I don't have one in front of me here, but the little pad and the pen in my pocket, or not even a pad. I had a napkin or a shirt sleeve. There's nothing that differentiated me, separated me from the people I was talking with. I could be anybody. I knew how to walk backwards into a crowd of people who were speaking and pretend not to be doing that. Sometimes I even got away with it. But that's the main difference between what I did in documentarians. The equipment, I think, is a big part of it.
And to kind of to wrap up the evening, looking at these and your work is very specific to the time period, but do you feel there's something about the city, the culture, the people who live here that kind of carries on no matter what decade it is, that there are parallels to today? What does your artist observer eye and ear tell us about the city today versus back then, and how those things are still connected?
People are people. And the ones who are drawn to New York, like I was, uh, are still coming. Everything, a lot of things, not everything, a lot of things are different. For example, everybody's glued to a screen of one size or another. And therefore, how I work, not practical. The people also, their educations are different. They grew up, I tried drawing on an iPad. They grew up with the digital world. There are no more phone booths on corners for Bobby to run to. Everything, in a way, is different. People aren't different. The people here today, even though it seems more crowded to me, but the people here today could be covered. And some young people who know how to do it are going to go do it, are doing it. I mean, there are graphic non, I don't know why they're called graphic nonfiction novels. You read a novel, or why does it have to be even called nonfiction? Why can't it be called something else? It's of itself. But graphic nonfiction novels and novels are very big deals today and being turned out by extremely talented writer artists. So there are forms through which you can get at these stories today. The people finally are exactly this. We're the same as 200 years ago, but 1,000 years ago, I think.
Well, Stan, thank you so much for sharing your art, your work, your stories.
You.
This was really incredible. Everyone who listened, please go out and get Stan's book so you can look at these drawings even more and read even more about the stories. But again, Stan, thank you so much.
And thank you, everybody who's listening. I really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I wish you all a great, beautiful summer evening and see you at our next program. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, William.
Bye, Stan.